Hello everyone, thank you for joining the stream, and in particular, thank you for joining this talk from concept to monster, a sound design process. My name is Juan Carlos Mariño, and I am the co-founder and audio lead of Trovador Sound Design and Music. Before we begin, let me give a huge shout out to EGD Collective for allowing this talk to be part of Waffle Games 7.0. Let me tell you a little bit more about myself. I started making video games 8 years ago at a global game jam, and in 2018 I co-founded Trovador Sound Design and Music. For 6 years, Trovador has been making music, sound effects, for both video games and audiovisuals. In parallel, I also work as a game designer at Ironhide Game Studio. Here are some screenshots of the projects that I have been part of. Now, let's go to the matter at hand. What does a sound designer do as part of a development team? Well, a sound designer has to separate all of the elements that are going to be part of the game, such as characters, powers, UI, into categories, and then create sounds for each one of them. Sounds are created using personal recordings, instruments, and synthesizers. Not everything can be solved with recording source material, so some sound effects are actually created by layering 2 or more different sources. Why is sound design so important for video games? Well, think about watching a movie. When you watch a film, you do so from the beginning to the end, and you have no input whatsoever in what happens, as the experience has been specifically tailored for the spectator. When you play a video game, what you do as a player begets a response from the game itself in accordance to your actions. Do you sneak upon an enemy? Or do you fight it directly? Do you use special powers? All of those actions will have different consequences, visually and sonically. That is called feedback. Feedback is the information the player receives as a result of his or her actions, decisions, and performance. This applies for characters, events, mechanics, audio, image, etc. So beyond breathing life into the world and its inhabitants, sound is used to convey important information to the player, with the use of cues and music. Let's take Metal Gear Solid as an example. Metal Gear Solid is an action stealth game where the player has to infiltrate a base undetected.
What was that noise? Who's that? I heard something. Where'd he go?
As you saw in the video, while the player remains undetected, music has a slow pace but still retains an element of tension. Footsteps and guard chatter are heard above everything else, but when the player is discovered, things change. An alarm fires up, the guards rush towards the main character, trying to kill him, and music goes up at a faster pace. When the player evades the guards, music changes again to reflect the transition towards safety. That is feedback at its finest. Now that we covered the basics of feedback, I want to show you how we approached sound design for the latest game I have been working on, Love Invasion. All of the footage you are going to see is part of a work in progress. Love Invasion is a bullet hell third-person shooter, where the player has to survive waves of attacking insectoid aliens. We will come back to that shortly, but first, let's review a bit of our process. Preparation is key. So the first thing we do is read the documentation and play an early build, if it exists, to become more familiar with the gameplay loop and aesthetics. Then we write down our game plan to document aesthetic and gameplay objectives as well as games that serve as reference. References are key for sound design, as we may run into similar obstacles as other designers. Learning from the work of others is helpful if you are stuck or need guidance. Now let's move towards the objectives. Guns are the real protagonists of the game. They need a strong sonic identity. Enemies swarm the player all the time, so their death sound will be heard constantly. It has to be simple and satisfying. Players need to hear the feedback of skill and power-up use clearly. Some of these elements you have heard in the footage played before. The final boss needs to stand out. Its mechanics need unique sounds to give clear feedback to the player. The soundtrack is composed of 4 pieces: a menu, a safe zone, a combat loop, and boss fight. The combat loop has to pump up the player without harming the experience. Going back to the bullet hell shooter, obviously Vampire Survivors was the main reference for the approach to sound. Both games have shared core gameplay elements, and Vampire Survivors gives clear feedback for power-ups, level-ups, and pickups. It has loopable action music, and it also has the risk of leading to a messy experience thanks to having multiple sound sources active at the same time. This is an excerpt of a spreadsheet we have been using to deliver the sound effects. As you can see, sounds are divided in categories and subcategories. We leave space so those in charge of game design can show us references or tell us what the sound should communicate to the player. We also leave space to provide our own notes regarding integration or aesthetic choices if needed. Let's take a moment to hear the sound of some of the guns that are in the game. Can you guess the type of sounds I will be teasing? These are the guns you heard. As you can see, we take notes on the main characteristics of each one so we can reflect that on the sound design. But this is a talk that mentions a monster, so give Mothership a warm welcome. Mothership is so far the final boss of the game, so it needs to feel special. We started by rounding up the key elements of the design of Mothership. It resembles a huge spider made of metal, mixed with organic elements. Mothership has 4 skills. It jumps over the player, it stomps the ground releasing a shockwave, it spits acid, and it spawns enemies. Let's start with how Mothership is supposed to sound at a vocal level. It is enormous and menacing, so it must belt out a disruptive screech that instills fear in the hearts of the hero of the game. We decided to base Mothership's screech on human vocalization and then twist it so it sounds more feral. Here is a screenshot of the tracks we have in our session. We built Mothership's screech from the ground up using an unchanged human vocal, and then added 2 more tracks with the same sound, both of them pitch shifted, one of them an octave above and the other 7 semitones below. All 3 of the tracks are affected by a tremolo effect to exaggerate the vibration of the giant monster's throat. Very well, so this is our Mothership sound effects session in Reaper. This is the software we use to create all of the sounds that are going to be in Love Invasion. We have different sessions for each category of sounds. This is Mothership's session, but we have one for enemies, another one for guns, and so on. As I mentioned earlier, Mothership's screech is made up by 3 tracks using the same scream, recorded by Nacho, the other co-founder of Trovador Sound. He recorded this for another project, but it didn't quite make the cut, so I brought it here. The first track is unchanged, so this is how Nacho sounds when he is unhappy. As you can see, there is something feral about the scream, and I liked how it saturated the microphone, like there was actually a creature screaming right next to my ears. For Mothership, I liked the idea of it sounding human but twisted, so I thought of straight ways of modifying it without losing that human scream. The second track has the scream pitch shifted down by 7 semitones, so it actually sounds more like a growl without going overboard. As you can hear, it clearly acts as a complement for the first track, filling the lower areas of the spectrum. Let's hear them together. Now you can see what I mean when I say that it acts as a complement. For me, it was still missing something important, so I toyed with the idea of adding another layer, but this time pitch shifting it up. It ended up being an octave up. Let's hear how it sounds by itself. As you can hear, it is really broken, and overall it is not really appealing to the ear, but it fulfills its purpose by being sort of grating. This track also fills the higher areas of the spectrum, so it goes very well alongside the others too. Let's hear them together. Now that we have the 3 vocals in unison, Mothership is almost fully formed, but there is something missing. We have the scream, the guttural part, and the grating part. What we need is another physical layer for the monster, which we achieved by the use of tremolo. Let's hear it again. Tremolo shifts the volume at a certain frequency, giving a sense of physicality to the screech, like the giant monster's throat is forcing enormous amounts of air. Now let's analyze one of Mothership's most aggressive abilities, the Quake Stomp. It is good to pay attention to the animation sequence of a character, so we can choose what to showcase with the final sound effect. As you can see, the sequence can be divided in 3, when the boss lifts its legs, when it hits the ground, and then the shockwave. Each of these 3 moments suggests an element that has to be communicated to the player. So we used servo motors to showcase Mothership's movement, a strong metal impact with a low end for the stomp, and a synthesizer with a flanger effect for the shockwave. Let's see what each of these layers adds up to Mothership's special attack. The Quake Stomp is a strong attack, so it had to feel impactful with regards to sound. Dividing it in 3 moments allowed us to highlight different elements for each moment, so it was more unique. The whole movement of Mothership lifting its legs in the air was achieved by using 2 layers of small servo motors from a small CNC printer that I recorded some years ago. So this is an extra tip. Hunt for sounds in your daily activities. If you don't have a recorder, record them using your phone. You never know when you are going to stumble into something useful. Back to the motors. They give us the movement we need, plus the heavy nod to machinery. Both layers are pitch shifted down, so they sound a little bit bigger. Since the originals were too bright for my taste, here is how it sounds without the shift. And with the shift again. And now the second motor, which is actually lower. And both together again. The impact is made up with a straight hit on a metal barrel and a cinematic bass drop. The barrel hit gives us the machinery Mothership is made of, and the bass drop adds to the strength of the giant monster's hit. Together, they sound like this. For the shockwave, I used Concept 2, a synthesizer by Krotos. I went for a simpler approach and used one of the synth's pulse sounds and modified its release to be longer so it had time to fade out. I I did this to mimic what in my mind I thought would be the shockwave moving away, losing power. To add extra movement that could reflect the shockwave's animations, I used a filter cutoff over the oscillator to convey that shifting feeling. The synth is also compressed, so it saturates a little, coupled with the previous impacts. All of the shockwaves go through a reverb, which actually helps them feel bigger. I have 3 different variations of shockwave. Number 1. This was number 2. And now, number 3. So why would I have 3 different variations of the shockwave? Because the Quake Stomp is an attack the mothership is going to use often. If it sounds the same every time, it loses impact over time. That is called listener fatigue. In order to avoid that, we introduce little variations to the sound so it doesn't lose its brightness. Now let's hear how this sounds all together. We start with the servo motors, then we add the impact, and finally we add the synth for the shockwaves. Both of these sound effects, the screech and the Quake Stomp, were made using mainly my own recordings, save for the barrel hit of the stomp, which comes from a library. There is nothing here that you couldn't do by yourself, and Reaper has a good set of tools for getting started. Krotos Concept is, however, paid software, but fairly accessible. In the end, sound design begets a lot of questions. Even after our sound effects are integrated into the game, they need to be tested. So these are some useful questions we can ask ourselves. Do players understand what we try to communicate through sound? Do our layers of sound effects end up disrupting the player's experience? Even if a sound can bother the player, is it useful for gameplay? Should it be changed or left untouched? Sometimes, answering these questions will send us back to the drawing board, and we may end up changing our approach completely. So, to sum it all up, read the documentation, talk to the team or client, play a build if you can, and then analyze which elements of gameplay need to be reinforced at sound level to convey meaning for the player, while creating something that belongs to the world of the game itself. This wraps up this small sneak peek to the world of sound design. And if you have any further questions, or if you want to show us some of your work, feel free to write to us at contact@trovadoursound.com. Thanks again to EGD Collective for letting us be part of Waffle Games 7.0. See you soon!